And joining us on the show today is Dr. Casey Luskin to discuss a brand new book he contributed to, Science and Faith in Dialogue, part of the Reformed Theology in Africa series. Dr. Luskin is Associate Director at Discovery Institute's Center for Science and Culture. He holds a law degree from the University of San Diego and has bachelor's and master's degrees in earth sciences, as well as a PhD in geology from the University of Johannesburg. He has spoken and written extensively on evolution and intelligent design, and has contributed to or edited more books than I think I can list, so I won't do that. But I could say Casey is uniquely qualified to help us understand our topic today. Welcome, Casey.
Thanks so much, Eric. It's a lot of fun to be here.
So tell us about this new anthology. How did it come about? Who are the contributing authors?
Yeah, so the book is titled Science and Faith in Dialogue, and I think it's a great book. It's actually free online. Hopefully, we can post a link to it with the podcast, available as a free PDF download. And it came about because of some relationships that were built by both myself and Brian Miller with folks in South Africa. As many ID the Future listeners probably may recall, I lived in South Africa from 2016 until partway through 2020, and obviously got to meet a number of people while I was there. And Discovery Institute has actually been building relationships with folks in South Africa for even before I went there for my PhD. And Brian Miller came out and spoke there, I think it was in 2018. And we met a professor at Northwest University of Potchefstroom, which is a public university. He, I believe, is a physics and engineering professor there named Frederick van Niekerk, or he goes by Frikkie for short. That's sort of a common South African term of endearment, or a shortened name. And he's a really great guy, a professor there, and he wanted to put together a volume dealing with issues related to science and faith, but very much focused on looking at the science. And is the science really promoting sort of this materialistic worldview that we are often told it does? So together, working with Professor van Niekerk, we put together a list of potential contributors to the book. And the book, over the last few years, it just slowly came together and was released in December of 2022. So I'm very excited about this book coming out.
Excellent. Yes. And so what we'll do is we will include a link. So the book covers a lot of stuff. I mean, everything from origin of life to, you mentioned Mike Keyes at the end there. I think his is the last chapter talking about, science and faith dialogue. Brian Miller talking about engineering application, and some others talking about fine tuning, those kinds of things. So it covers a lot of stuff. And your chapter is entitled Evolutionary Models of Palaeoanthropology. Genetics and Psychology Fail to Account for Human Origins. That's quite an intimidating title. Tell us maybe in simple terms, in just a sentence or two, what you're covering in this review.
Yeah, so my chapter is basically about human origins, and I look at it from three different academic scientific fields. Number one would be paleoanthropology, looking at the hominid fossil record. Number two would be genetics, and number three would be psychology, specifically evolutionary psychology. And I ask if in each of those fields the evidence supports an evolutionary account of human origins.
So paleoanthropology, that's a long, intimidating word. What does that mean?
Yeah, paleoanthropology is just the scientific study of human beings, of humanity. And of course, paleoanthropology is studying our origins, looking at human beings in the past. So it's looking at essentially the origin of human beings in the deep past.
Okay, great. So tell me a little bit about your particular interest in contributing to this volume. You mentioned you had spent some time in Africa and, of course, have a connection there while you were working on your PhD. But why did you get interested in contributing to this?
Yeah, so I appreciate the question. I lived in South Africa for about almost 4.5 years, from 2016 to midway through 2020. And while I was there, I got to go to a number of hominid sites and had some experiences to really learn a lot about hominids. This was not the topic of my PhD research, but it was something that when I had free time, I would go and visit a lot of places of interest to human origins. And one of the places I visited is the Maripang Museum near Johannesburg. In fact, this museum is just north of Johannesburg in what is called the Cradle of Humankind, a very famous fossil hominid set of sites where they have found many different hominid locations within, I don't know, a location maybe the size of Tacoma or something like that. Mm-hmm. I made that up, but it's not a big area, and there's a number of hominid sites. In fact, the Maripang Museum and the Cradle of Humankind were not at all far from where I lived. If you were to go to my apartment that my wife and I rented in South Africa, in Johannesburg, and if you were to walk about 3 blocks down the street and then turn left, and stay on that street for about 40 minutes. It would dead end at the cradle of
Oh,
humankind.
wow.
So we felt a lot of, connection to this area. And so the Maripang Museum, I would say, is probably arguably the world's most world-class hominid fossil paleoanthropology museum that's out there. It is
Mm.
just an incredibly good museum. Clearly, the South African government and other donors put a lot of money into just making it into a fantastic place to learn about human origins. It's very, very impressive. And I went there a number of times while I was in South Africa with various friends who would come to visit. I also would sometimes take people in groups, even on tours of the museum. These are just very informally organized because they wanted to learn about human origins, but also understand, what is wrong with the standard evolutionary story of human origins. So I would take people there. And over time, I developed what I call a visitor's guide to the Maripang Museum because I got tired of saying the same thing over and over again. I would just give people my visitor's guide. And I thought it was a pretty good visitor's guide. And eventually, when this book opportunity came up, they said, well, what would you like to contribute to a South African published book about science and faith? And I said, well, I would love to publish my visitor's guide to the
Mm.
Maripang Museum.
The next section of your chapter, we're talking about now the third group, which is the Homo group. So if I'm understanding your viewpoint, that would include really Homo sapiens, of course, Homo erectus, Neanderthals, but perhaps not Homo habilis?
Yes, there have been a number of studies by actually leading paleoanthropologists that looked at the skeletal morphology of Homo habilis and found that actually in every case, it belonged within Australopithecines.
Mm.
And they found that, really the reason why people have put it within Homo is because they wanted this species to be associated with tool use. But I think that even then, it's very difficult to link any particular set of bones with a set of hominid tools. And so that is a tenuous argument to make that we know for a fact that Homo habilis did use tools. And so I think it's better classified within Australopithecus.
Okay, interesting. No chance they're going to rename it, though, right?
Well, this has been proposed. Again, you get different
Okay.
opinions. So there have been multiple papers that would call it actually Australopithecus habilis rather than Homo habilis.
Okay, all right. So as we move into the genus Homo, is there a clear evolutionary progression?
So this is one of the most interesting aspects of the hominid fossil record, Eric, and that is that the genus Homo appears abruptly in the fossil record. And essentially what we find is that when human-like forms finally do appear, they appear abruptly without direct ape-like evolutionary precursors. And in fact, this is well attested to in the literature. You can find people talking about the abrupt transition to the genus Homo, or the lack of fossils documenting an evolutionary transition between the Australopithecines and the genus Homo. Ernst Mayr said that we have no fossils that can serve as missing links. And he says that the earliest fossils of Homo are separated from Australopithecus by a, quote, large unbridged gap. So I find this very interesting that we find in the fossil record right where the genus Homo, basically the human-like form, is supposed to appear, we do not find fossils documenting how those individuals and how those species evolved and what they evolved from. There's this large unbridged gap in the fossil record associated with the origin of these human-like members of the genus Homo. And for me, that's very significant in challenging the standard evolutionary story of human origins.
Yeah, you mentioned Ernst Mayr. I was just blown away by this quote of his in your chapter. He says, not having any fossils that can serve as missing, and he's talking specifically about human evolution here. He says, not having any fossils that can serve as missing links, we have to fall back on the time-honored method of historical science, the construction of a historical narrative. So to me, this just jumps out, at once both a remarkable admission of ignorance as well as saying, hey, the story is really what's driving the process here rather than the data.
Absolutely. There's an evolutionary paradigm that governs the interpretation of virtually every fossil that is found. And that's okay. I mean, people are allowed to have models and interpret data within a model. I don't have a problem with that.
Mm-hmm.
The question I have is whether other models are also consistent with the data. For example, there was a commentator from the University of Michigan a few years back talking about the origin of the genus Homo, and they called it a Big Bang origin, the genus Homo, where we're talking about sort of an explosive origin of basically the human-like forms in the fossil record. And I would say that when we talk about, Big Bang origins or explosions or abrupt appearance, this kind of language requires a very rapid infusion of new information into the biosphere to generate a new body plan, a new type of organism. And that, in my opinion at least, is better reflective of intelligent design, an instance of design in the history of biology, in the history of life, rather than sort of a gradual evolutionary scheme. So I think that there are certainly other ways to look at the data that are very consistent with the evidence and support a more design-based view and not the standard evolutionary view.
Right. So, what's the bottom line, Casey, as we look at the fossil record as it currently stands in regards to human evolution?
Yeah, so the bottom line is that most fossils that we find in the hominid fossil record fall into one of two categories: ape-like species or human-like species, Eric. And there is a large unbridged gap between those groups. And I think that the origin of the genus Homo, right when the human body plan, the human-like body plan appears, is where we are missing fossils. This gap, this large unbridged gap, is well attested to in the mainstream literature. This is not something that is being made up by ID people. It's a real problem for evolutionary schemes. It does not get talked about enough, and I think it needs to be talked about more. If you want to read a lot of the documentation of this abrupt appearance of our genus Homo and the lack of evidence for how the genus Homo evolved, go ahead and read my chapter. It's all in there.